On the morning of June 19, 1944, a Navy fighter pilot named Alex Vrashu, 25 years old, from East Chicago, Indiana, sat in the cockpit of a Hellcat on the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Lexington and waited to take off. In the next 8 minutes of flying, he would shoot down 6 Japanese aircraft over the Philippine Sea. He would land back on his carrier with fewer than 400 rounds of ammunition left in his guns. He would climb out of the cockpit. He would look at his squadron mates. And he would say quietly that he'd like to be excused. He'd had it. 250 miles to the west, at almost the same hour, a Japanese vice admiral named Jisaburo Ozawa stood on the flag bridge of the newest aircraft carrier in the world and watched his career end. Ozawa was 57 years old. He commanded 9 aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, and more than 400 aircraft. It was the largest concentration of Japanese naval aviation assembled since the attack on Pearl Harbor, 2.5 years earlier. He believed on this morning that he was about to change the course of the war. By sunset, 3 of his carriers would be burning or sunk. 600 of his aircraft would be gone. Nearly 3,000 of his sailors and airmen would be dead. And Ozawa, standing on the deck of a cruiser because his flagship no longer existed, would be forced to confront a truth that no Japanese admiral had ever been trained to accept. The Americans were not bringing carriers to the battle. They were manufacturing them faster than Japan could sink them. This is not a story of a battle. This is the story of a miscalculation. A miscalculation so vast, so total, so quietly devastating, that it would break the men who made it long before it broke their empire. To understand what happened in the Philippine Sea, you must first understand what aircraft carriers meant to the men who commanded the Imperial Japanese Navy. You must understand a country that believed it had invented the future of naval warfare, and a doctrine built on a single word. Kessen. The decisive battle. For 40 years since the guns of Tsushima had shattered the Russian fleet in 1905, Japanese naval officers had been trained to believe that wars at sea were decided by a single cataclysmic engagement. 2 fleets. 1 horizon. 1 afternoon of fire and steel. The nation that won the decisive battle won the war. The nation that lost it negotiated. This was not theory. It was scripture. And the aircraft carrier in Japanese hands was the new dreadnought. The new weapon of decision. Japan had pioneered carrier aviation in the Pacific. The Hasho, commissioned in 1922, was the first purpose-built aircraft carrier in the world. By the late 1930s, Japan possessed the finest carrier fleet on the planet. The Akagi and the Kaga, converted from battle cruiser and battleship hulls, displaced over 40,000 tons and carried between 60 and 90 aircraft each. The Soryu and the Hiryu, purpose-built and fast and elegant, were the sharpest instruments of naval aviation ever launched. Japanese carrier pilots trained for years, thousands of flight hours, until they could take off and land at night in weather that grounded every other navy in the world. The Zero fighter that flew from their decks in 1941 was more maneuverable and longer range than any carrier-based fighter the Americans or the British could put in the air. On December 7, 1941, 6 of these carriers sailed into a launch position 230 miles north of Oahu. 350 aircraft. 2 waves. 1 morning. By the time the second wave returned to their carriers, 8 American battleships were destroyed or damaged. Over 2,400 Americans were dead. Japan had lost 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines. Not a single Japanese carrier had been touched. On the flag bridge of the carrier Akagi, Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, the pilot who had led the strike, transmitted the code words that told Tokyo the surprise was total. Tora, Tora, Tora. The men on those bridges believed in that moment that they had won a war. One man did not. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was 59 years old on the day of Pearl Harbor. He was short, broad-shouldered, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from a shell explosion at Tsushima in his youth. He was also, of all the men wearing the uniform of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the one who understood the United States best. He had studied at Harvard from 1919 to 1921. He had served as naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928. He had ridden the trains of America across 3,000 miles of prairie and mountain and industry. He had walked the automobile plants of Detroit. He had seen the steel mills of Pittsburgh at night, glowing orange, working 3 shifts, never stopping. In January of 1941, 11 months before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto wrote a private letter to a political ally named Ryoichi Sasakawa. In it he described what the coming war would look like. In the first 6 months, he wrote, "I will run wild. I will win victory after victory. But I have utterly no confidence for the second and third year." He was not being modest. He was calculating. He had seen the machines. He had seen the men who built the machines. He had watched America make things at a scale that Japan, for all her discipline and skill in steel, simply could not match. And he tried, in the quiet way that senior officers try, to warn the Naval General Staff. They read his reports. They filed them. And they went to war anyway. For 6 months Yamamoto was right. Japanese carriers rampaged across the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. They supported the conquest of the Philippines, of Malaya, of the Dutch East Indies. They struck Ceylon. They drove the Royal Navy back to the coast of East Africa. Nothing on the sea could stop them. Then, on the morning of June 4, 1942, 6 months and 3 days after Pearl Harbor, four Japanese fleet carriers stood at flight quarters 200 miles northwest of a small atoll called Midway. At 10:22 in the morning, American dive bombers appeared out of the sun. 6 minutes later, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were burning wrecks. By the afternoon, Hiryu was gone as well. 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen were dead. Hundreds of the most experienced carrier pilots in the world, men who could not be replaced, were killed in the space of an hour. Yamamoto received the news aboard his flagship, the battleship Yamato. His staff officers would later remember that he did not speak for a long time. He simply sat, holding the message, understanding what it meant. The prophecy he had written to Sasakawa 18 months earlier had come true, exactly on schedule. 6 months of running wild. And then the ceiling had begun to fall. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the carriers at both Pearl Harbor and Midway, was 55 years old, a torpedo officer by training, a man who had never wanted to command carriers in the first place. Within months he would be reassigned. He would never command a carrier operation again. 2 years later he would put a pistol to his head in a cave on Saipan, but that is a scene for later in this story. Whatever Nagumo understood on the day Midway ended, he kept it to himself. What is on the record is that the man who had commanded the greatest carrier operation in Japanese history was quietly moved out of the story of Japanese naval aviation, and that the war his ships had opened would go on without him at its center. But here is what makes this story a tragedy and not merely a defeat. On the day the 4 carriers burned at Midway, the men who lost them did not know that the machine that would kill their empire had already been building for over a year. They did not know about Newport News. On April 28, 1941, 7 months and 10 days before Pearl Harbor, a keel had been laid at the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company, on the tidal reach of the James River in Virginia. It was the keel of a new kind of aircraft carrier. It would displace 27,000 tons. It would run 888 feet from bow to stern. It would carry 90 aircraft, cruise at 33 knots, and swallow damage that would sink any Japanese carrier afloat. Her name was Essex. She was not a reaction to Pearl Harbor. She was not a reaction to Midway. She was the product of a law that had been signed the previous summer, in July of 1940, called the Two-Ocean Navy Act. In a single stroke of the pen, President Franklin Roosevelt had authorized a 70% expansion of the United States Navy. 18 new fleet carriers. 7 new battleships. 29 cruisers. Hundreds of destroyers and submarines. The Americans had not been surprised by the war. They had begun preparing for it while Japan still believed it was choosing the moment. Essex would be commissioned on December 31, 1942. Yorktown, named for the carrier lost at Midway, would follow in April 1943. Lexington, named for the carrier lost in the Coral Sea, in February. Bunker Hill in May. Intrepid in August. Hornet, named for another ship the Japanese had sunk, in November. Wasp, likewise named for a lost sister, in the same month. Every Japanese victory in the first year of the war was being answered by a new American ship carrying the name of the ship the victory had killed. And the ships kept coming. By late 1943, in the shipyards of Newport News and Brooklyn and Quincy and Norfolk and Philadelphia, a new Essex-Class carrier was being commissioned every 60 days. 30,000 workers labored at Newport News alone. 70,000 at Brooklyn. Women who had never held a welding torch in their lives were building the compartments of ships that would fight in oceans they had never seen. The keels were laid down in modules, prefabricated in workshops miles from the water, and assembled on the ways like the components of an enormous, floating machine. Where a carrier had once taken 4 years to build, the Americans were finishing them in 14 months. Then in 12. Japanese intelligence knew this was happening. Reports came in from diplomatic sources, from agents in South America, from radio traffic and open press. The reports were read at the Naval General Staff in Tokyo. The numbers were tabulated. And nobody at the highest levels quite believed them. Because to believe them was to believe that the war was already lost. And so, through the winter of 1943 and into the spring of 1944, Japan built her replacements as fast as her exhausted shipyards would allow. 2 carriers converted from ocean liner hulls, called Junyo and Hayo. Compromised ships, slower than the fleet, carrying fewer aircraft, built because there was nothing else to build them from. And 1 true fleet carrier, laid down in 1941 and completed in the spring of 1944. She was named Taiho. Great Phoenix. She was the finest ship the Imperial Japanese Navy had ever launched. 37,000 tons. An armored flight deck, the first on any Japanese carrier, designed to shrug off bomb hits that would have gutted her predecessors. A modern anti-aircraft battery. Roughly 60 aircraft. She was the ship that was supposed to prove that Japanese quality could still answer American quantity. On the morning of June 19, 1944, she flew the flag of Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. He had spent the previous week at Taui in the Sulu archipelago, briefing his captains, drilling his aviators, walking the flight decks of his 9 carriers. He knew his pilots were not what they had been at Midway. Half of them had fewer than 300 flight hours. Some had never landed on a carrier deck at all before the sortie. The fuel shortage had cut their training to the bone. But he had a plan. The plan was called Ego. His aircraft carried longer range than American aircraft. He would strike the American fleet from beyond their reach. His planes, after attacking, would land on the Japanese airfields of Guam and Rota and Tinian, refuel, rearm, and strike again on the way home. He would be supported by 500 land-based aircraft flying from the Marianas. The plan was elegant. The plan was doctrinally sound. The plan was the decisive battle that Japanese naval officers had spent 40 years dreaming of. The plan was already dead. Because 6 days earlier, on June 13, 1944, aircraft from a task force he did not yet fully believe existed had appeared over Guam and Saipan and Tinian. And the airfields he was counting on, the 500 aircraft that were supposed to double his striking power, were already burning on the ground. He simply did not know it yet. At 6 in the morning on the flag bridge of Taiho, in a sea flat as glass, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa gave the order to launch his first strike. 69 aircraft climbed into the pale sky and turned east, toward the American fleet. He watched them go. He believed he was about to win the war. 250 miles east of Taiho, in the pre-dawn dark of June 19, 1944, a very different kind of morning was beginning. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher stood on the flag bridge of the aircraft carrier Lexington. Not the old Lexington. Not the ship that had burned and sunk in the Coral Sea in the spring of 1942. This was the new Lexington. Essex-Class. 27,000 tons. Commissioned in February of 1943. The Japanese, monitoring American radio traffic, had reported her sunk 4 separate times in the previous year. Each time she had reappeared, off a different island, launching aircraft. Her crew had started calling her the Blue Ghost. Mitcher was 57 years old, the same age as Ozawa. A small, weather-beaten man with a face like tanned leather and a khaki cap pulled low against the sun. He had been flying since 1916. He had commanded the carrier Hornet at the Battle of Midway. He wore his own uniform loosely, spoke rarely, and had a gift, rare among admirals, for trusting the men beneath him to do their jobs. Under his command that morning were 15 aircraft carriers. 7 of them were Essex-Class fleet carriers. 2 were older ships that had somehow survived the first 2 years of the war. 6 were light carriers of the Independence class, built on cruiser hulls, quick and small and lethal. Between them they carried 900 aircraft. 3 times what Ozawa was bringing to the fight. And that was only the beginning of the American advantage. Because Ozawa did not know it, but the American submarines had been watching him since the moment his fleet left Taui. On June 15, 4 days before the battle, the submarine USS Flying Fish had surfaced in the San Bernardino Strait, off the Philippines, and radioed a contact report. A large Japanese force steaming east. On June 17 at 7 in the evening, The submarine USS Cavala had made contact with the main body of Ozawa's fleet, 600 miles east of the Philippines. She had reported it. Then she had followed it, running submerged by day, surfacing at night to keep pace, sending contact reports every few hours. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the 5th Fleet from the cruiser Indianapolis, knew almost exactly where Ozawa was. He knew when Ozawa turned east. He knew when Ozawa began launching aircraft. The decisive battle that Japanese naval doctrine had prepared for since the era of Tsushima, the surprise ambush that would unhinge the American Pacific offensive, was being conducted by an enemy who had been reading Ozawa's mail. 6 days earlier, on June 13, Mitcher's carriers had struck the airfields of Guam, Saipan, Tinian, and Rota. For 4 straight days, American fighters and dive bombers had worked over those runways with the patience of men killing something slowly. They had cratered the concrete. They had set the fuel tanks alight. They had caught aircraft on the ground and machine-gunned them into scrap. By the morning of June 19, the 500 land-based aircraft that were supposed to double Ozawa's striking power did not exist anymore. Some had been destroyed on the tarmac. Others had scrambled up to fight, and the Hellcats had shot them out of the sky. A handful had fled to airfields further west. Fewer than 50 aircraft were still combat-capable in the entire Marianas chain. The other half of Ozawa's plan was already dead. He simply did not know it yet. A little after 10 in the morning, more than 2 hours after they had left their carriers, Ozawa's first strike, 69 aircraft, appeared on the American radar screens. They were still 150 miles away. Aboard the Essex-Class carrier Lexington, in a compartment that Japanese planners in 1941 had not even imagined, the fighter director, Lieutenant Joseph Eggert, watched the incoming raid materialize on his scope. He picked up a microphone. Voices went out across the task force. Radar vectored orders. Precise headings. Precise altitudes. Precise ranges. 220 Hellcats climbed into the morning sky. They were flown by pilots who had, on average, 300 hours of flight time before ever entering combat. They flew Grumman F-6F fighters that were faster than the Zero at every altitude above 5,000 feet, better armored, more heavily armed. Their pilots had been trained by veterans of Guadalcanal and Midway, men rotated home to teach what they had learned in blood. The Japanese pilots climbing to meet them had been trained on rations of aviation fuel measured in gallons. Many had never fired their guns against another aircraft. Some, according to post-war interrogations, had fewer than 80 hours of flight time in their logbooks. What happened next, the American pilots would later name the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. They picked the Japanese formations apart in the air. They dove out of the sun and killed the escorts and then killed the bombers. Zeros fell trailing smoke. Torpedo planes broke apart under the concentrated fire of the Hellcats' 6.50 caliber machine guns. A young American pilot named Alex Vrashu shot down 6 aircraft in 8 minutes. Of the 69 aircraft in the first strike, 42 were destroyed before they even reached the American fleet. The survivors dropped their bombs into empty water. Only 27 returned to Ozawa's carriers. Half an hour after the first strike had gone, Ozawa launched his second. 128 aircraft. 98 were shot down. He launched a third. 47 aircraft. 7 returned. He launched a fourth. 82 aircraft. 9 came back. By the middle of the afternoon, of the more than 370 aircraft Ozawa had launched, roughly 100 limped back to their carriers. Many were damaged. Their pilots stared at the deck officers with the blank exhaustion of men who could not yet articulate what they had seen. They had flown into a wall. In 4 hours, Japanese carrier aviation was annihilated. The Americans had lost 29 aircraft, most of them to operational accidents. The exchange rate was more than 10 to 1. But the disaster was not over. Not by a very long way. At 8:16 in the morning, only a few minutes after Ozawa's first strike had launched, the submarine USS Albacore, commanded by Commander James Blanchard, had raised her periscope in the middle of the Japanese fleet. Blanchard could not believe what he saw. A Japanese aircraft carrier. Large. No. Passing across his lens at a range under 3,000 yards. Behind her, more carriers. Battleships. Cruisers. The heart of the Imperial Japanese Navy, sliding by his periscope like a parade. The carrier in his sights was Taiho, Ozawa's flagship. The finest ship in the Japanese Navy. Blanchard fired 6 torpedoes. The Albacore's torpedo data computer, the electromechanical brain that calculated firing solutions, chose that moment to fail. The torpedoes were fired on manual estimates. 5 would miss. 1 would run true. At 9:09 in the morning, one American submarine torpedo struck Taiho on the starboard side, forward, just below the waterline. For a moment, nothing seemed to have happened. The great ship shuddered. She took on a small list. Her aircraft continued to launch. A young pilot named Seikyo Komatsu, taking off in a Judy dive bomber and seeing one of the other torpedoes running toward his own carrier, deliberately flew his aircraft into the water, detonating the torpedo with his own body. He was one of the finest pilots left in the Japanese Navy. He died so that Taiho would live. She lived for a while. The damage seemed manageable. The forward aviation fuel tank had been ruptured. Gasoline was leaking into the bilges. The forward elevator was jammed in the down position. But she was steaming. She was launching aircraft. She could fight. At this point, the story of Taiho becomes the story of a mistake that no history book can prove with certainty, and that most naval historians accept as the most probable explanation for what happened next. An inexperienced damage control officer, faced with the smell of aviation gasoline building up in the forward compartments, ordered the ship's ventilation system turned on to full power. He wanted to purge the fumes. Instead, he distributed them. Aviation gasoline vapor, invisible, heavier than air where it pooled and lighter than air where it spread, seeped through Taiho's ductwork into every compartment of the ship. For 6 hours it accumulated. The crew smelled it. They opened hatches. They tried to vent the fumes overboard. The fumes kept coming. At 3:32 in the afternoon, more than 6 hours after the single torpedo had struck, a spark of some kind, an electrical arc, a boot on a metal deck, a cigarette that should not have been lit, ignited the vapor. Taiho detonated. The armored flight deck, thousands of tons of steel plate designed to shrug off American bombs, lifted upward like the lid of a coffin. The ship's sides blew outward. Aviation ordnance in the hangar deck cooked off in a chain of secondary explosions. Fire consumed the interior of the ship from bow to stern. Vice Admiral Ozawa, standing on the flag bridge, did not want to leave. His staff pressed him. He was the commander. He had brought them here. He believed, in the tradition of his service, that he should go down with the ship. He gave orders for the Emperor's portrait, kept in a shrine on every Japanese warship, to be taken from Taiho so that the enemy could not desecrate it. His officers finally persuaded him to transfer his flag. He was transferred by launch to the heavy cruiser Higuro, where he stood, soot-streaked, in a borrowed uniform, watching Taiho settle in the water. She sank at 4:28 in the afternoon. More than 1,600 sailors and airmen went down with her. Ozawa's flagship, the finest carrier in the Imperial Japanese Navy, killed by a single torpedo and a well-intentioned mistake. 200 miles to the west, at almost the same hour, the submarine USS Kavala, the same submarine that had been shadowing Ozawa's fleet for 2 days, had worked her way into an attack position on a second Japanese carrier. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Herman Kostler, put her at periscope depth and looked through the lens. He saw an aircraft carrier of the Shokaku-class, aircraft recovering on her flight deck, 3,000 yards away. She was, in fact, Shokaku herself. Shokaku was a survivor. She was one of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. She had fought at the Coral Sea, at the Eastern Solomons, at Santa Cruz. She had been damaged repeatedly and rebuilt and sent back into the war. She was one of the last 2 Pearl Harbor carriers still afloat. Her crew was among the most experienced in the fleet. Kostler fired 6 torpedoes. For ran true. At 12:22 in the afternoon, 3 torpedoes struck Shokaku in rapid succession along her starboard side. The 4th, some accounts suggest, may have hit as well. What is certain is that the impact points were catastrophic. Fires broke out in the hangar deck. Aviation fuel ignited. Aircraft that had just landed, still fueled and armed, began to explode where they sat. For nearly 3 hours, Shokaku's damage control parties fought her. They flooded magazines. They opened seacocks. They tried to save a ship that had refused to die at Coral Sea, at Santa Cruz, in every place her enemies had sent to kill her. At 3:01 in the afternoon, 31 minutes before Taiho blew apart, Shokaku's aviation fuel and bomb magazines detonated in a single, thunderous explosion that broke her back. She rolled to starboard. She went under bow first. 1,272 men went with her. The last of the Pearl Harbor carriers, save one, had ceased to exist. The following evening, June 20th, in the fading light, a strike from the American carriers finally caught Ozawa's retreating fleet. The carrier Hayo took 2 torpedoes in her engineering spaces, burned through the night, and sank shortly before midnight. By dawn on June 21st, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, standing on the deck of the cruiser Higuro, had lost 3 aircraft carriers, more than 400 aircraft, and nearly 3,000 men. He had accomplished nothing. Not a single American aircraft carrier had been sunk. Not a single American aircraft carrier had been seriously damaged. The decisive battle that Japanese naval doctrine had prepared for since the days of Tsushima, the ambush that was supposed to change the course of the Pacific War, had been a slaughter of Japanese aviators by an enemy who had known where they were coming from and what to do when they arrived. And here, in the wreckage of that afternoon, comes the moment that gives this story its title. That night, aboard the cruiser Higuro, in a wardroom lit by dim battle lanterns, Ozawa read the reconnaissance reports his surviving scouts had brought back from over the American fleet during the day. The reports counted the American aircraft carriers. The number they gave him was 15. He did not believe it. He would say so later, under interrogation by American naval officers in the autumn of 1945. He would tell them, through a translator, that his first reaction on reading the reports had been to assume his scouts were wrong. Perhaps they had counted the same carriers twice. Perhaps they were mistaking cruisers or oilers for carriers. Perhaps they were counting escort carriers as fleet carriers. Because if the count was correct, if there were truly 15 American aircraft carriers in the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944, then everything he had been taught about the war he was fighting was wrong. Japan had entered the war with 10 aircraft carriers. By this evening she had 8. The Americans, in the 2.5 years since Pearl Harbor, had built roughly 25. And Ozawa was looking at 15 of them. He asked his intelligence officer to check the count. He asked again. The count was correct. 7 Essex-Class fleet carriers. 2 older fleet carriers. 6 Independence-class light carriers. 900 aircraft. And more he now understood were being built. Right now. In shipyards he had studied on maps at the Naval War College. Right now, in Newport News and Brooklyn and Quincy and Norfolk and Philadelphia. Right now, while he stood in a borrowed uniform on the deck of a cruiser, watching the sea burn where his flagship used to be. 6,000 miles away, in a country he had never been to, women were welding the hull plates of the next Essex. And the next. And the next. He turned from the reconnaissance photographs and stared out at the black water. He said nothing. His staff officers, remembering that night after the war, would say he stood there for a very long time. There was, in that moment, nothing to say. 15 aircraft carriers. He had brought 9. He had lost 3. And by the time the sun rose again over the Philippine Sea, more American carriers were already being laid down. Keels going into place on empty ways. New names being chosen. New crews being trained. Every dawn in America was another dawn in which more of the machine was being built. In another cabin, that same night, an admiral not yet named in this story was making an entry in a leather-bound diary that would survive the war and be published, decades later, in an American university press. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, 54 years old, commander of the 1st Battleship Division, had spent the day watching the sky from the bridge of the battleship Yamato, further west with the surface fleet. He had listened to the fragmentary reports coming in over the radio. He had seen the strike aircraft return in 1s and 2s when they had been sent out in 10s and dozens. That night, in his cabin, he wrote in careful, small brushstrokes what he had understood during the day. He wrote that Japan had lost the ability to conduct carrier operations on a scale that could challenge American naval power. He wrote that no Japanese victory, however brilliant, could now change the shape of the war. He wrote that the mathematics had become hopeless. He put down the brush. He closed the diary. He would keep writing in it, night after night, for another 14 months. But everything he wrote after this night would be, in one way or another, an elaboration of what he had understood on the evening of June 19, 1944. The war was lost. Not tomorrow. Not next month. Not in a single, cataclysmic battle. But slowly, inexorably, at the rate at which American shipyards could roll new carriers down the ways into the Chesapeake and the East River and the harbor of Quincy, Massachusetts. Ugaki understood. Ozawa understood. Yamamoto, dead in the jungle of Bougainville for over a year now, had understood before any of them. The men who had not yet understood on the night of June 19, 1944, were the men in the Naval General Staff building in Tokyo. The men who had read Yamamoto's warnings and filed them. The men who had counted American carriers on paper for 3 years and never quite believed the count. They were about to understand as well. Because the war was not over. Japan still had 4 aircraft carriers afloat. She still had 1 Pearl Harbor veteran left, the carrier Zuikaku, sister of the Shokaku that had gone down that afternoon. She still had thousands of aircraft if not the pilots to fly them. She still had a naval general staff that could not bring itself to say aloud, in the presence of the emperor, what any competent staff officer had come to understand. And in 4 months, in the Philippine Sea's colder sister waters off the island of Leyte, the last carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy would be sent out one final time. Not to fight, not to win, but as bait. Because the men who commanded them had come to understand, in the terrible clarity that follows disaster, that a Japanese aircraft carrier in 1944 was no longer a warship. It was a target. And if Japan could no longer use her carriers to sink American ships, she would use them for the only purpose they had left. She would use them to die well. 4 months later, on the morning of October 25, 1944, the last aircraft carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy were steaming south toward their own funeral. They did not know that yet. Some of the men on their flight decks still believed they were going to fight a battle. The admiral commanding them knew better. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, 57 years old, stood again on a flag bridge. This time it was the bridge of the carrier Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier of the 6 that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Her hull was scarred from 3 years of combat. Her crew had grown up on her. She had outlived her 5 sisters, one by one, and now she was carrying the flag of a man who had been ordered to lose her. That was the order. Ozawa had received it in early October in a conference room in Tokyo, from Admiral Somu Toyoda, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. Toyoda was 59 years old, hard-faced, politically connected, a man who had inherited a navy that no longer existed in any meaningful form. He had explained the plan called Shogo 1. It was a plan of ambush and misdirection. A plan built on the acceptance that Japan could not win a fleet action, and could only hope, in one final gamble, to sink the American transports off the beaches of Leyte before the invasion of the Philippines could take root. The plan had many moving parts. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita would take the main battleship force, including the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, through the San Bernardino Strait and fall upon the American landing zone from the north. A second surface force would come from the south. And Ozawa, with what was left of the carrier fleet, would sail down from the empty north to serve as bait. That was the word Toyota had used. Bait. Ozawa had 4 carriers. Zuikaku and 3 light carriers named Zuho, Chitos, and Chiyoda. Between them they carried 108 aircraft. Many of the pilots had fewer than 50 flight hours. Some had never taken off from a moving deck. Ozawa understood. He asked no questions. He returned to his ships. He sailed. His job was to be seen. His job was to draw Admiral William Halsey and the American Third Fleet away from the beaches. He would let American reconnaissance find him. He would let the American carriers race north to destroy him. He would sacrifice every ship in his command and most likely, every man aboard them, so that Kurita's battleships could reach the transports and set the invasion on fire. That was the mission. He had accepted it in the same silence in which he had accepted the reconnaissance count in the Philippine Sea 4 months earlier. There was nothing to argue with. There was only the arithmetic. The Japanese carrier arm was a hollow shell. Better to use the shell for something than to leave it rusting in Kure Harbor. Better to die well. For a full day on October 24th, he cruised in circles 400 miles east of Luzon, launching search planes, breaking radio silence, doing everything an admiral could do to be found. The Americans did not find him. Their reconnaissance was looking the wrong way, toward the surface fleets closing from the west. Ozawa, the man Japan had ordered to be spotted, could not get himself spotted. He steamed closer to the American fleet. He turned on his radios. He launched his aircraft in an ineffective strike, half of which never made it back so that at least the pilots would be seen by American radar. Late in the afternoon, an American scout plane finally saw him. The message went up the chain of command. To Admiral William Halsey, 61 years old, aggressive to the point of recklessness, a battleship man who wanted nothing in his life more than to catch and sink the enemy's aircraft carriers, the message meant one thing. He turned north at full speed with every fast carrier in his fleet, chasing the bait. He left the San Bernardino Strait unguarded behind him. Ozawa understood. Somewhere on the bridge of Zuikaku that night, as his ship raced north with the American carriers closing behind him, he must have known that his part of the plan was working exactly as designed. Halsey had taken the hook. What Ozawa could not know and would not learn for many hours, was that Kurita, off Samar the next morning, would falter. Would engage a screen of American escort carriers and destroyers. Would take losses. Would turn away without ever reaching the invasion beaches. Would waste the sacrifice. But that is a story that belongs to other ships. For Ozawa, the sacrifice was arriving on schedule. On the morning of October 25, 1944, over 500 American aircraft came out of the eastern sky over Cape Agnano. They came from Essex-Class carriers. Intrepid. Franklin. Lexington, the blue ghost that had killed Ozawa's flagship in June and had come now to finish what she had started. Enterprise, oldest and toughest of the pre-war carriers. Independence-class light carriers running in tight formation. The strikes came in waves. 6 of them hour after hour, through the morning and into the afternoon. Zuho was hit first, then Chitos. Chitos rolled over and sank before noon. Zuho burned steadily through the day. Chiyoda was crippled by mid-morning, drifting, on fire, her crew fighting flames that would not go out. Zuikaku, Ozawa's flagship, took torpedoes and bombs in the second wave. She listed. Her aircraft could no longer launch. Her flight deck was buckled and cratered. She kept steaming, dying by degrees for hours. At 2 in the afternoon, his staff transferred him by destroyer to a light cruiser named Iodo. He went where he was told, in the same silence in which he had left Taiho 4 months earlier. For the second time that year, he watched his flagship die from the deck of another ship. At 2:14 in the afternoon, Zuikaku, the last of the Pearl Harbor carriers, rolled to port and slid stern-first into the Philippine Sea. Her flag came down as she went under. Almost 850 men died with her. She was the ship that had launched aircraft over Oahu on the morning of December 7, 1941. She had been at Coral Sea. She had been at Santa Cruz. She had been at the Philippine Sea in June. She had outlived every ship that had sailed to Pearl Harbor with her. Now she was a wreck on the ocean floor. By the end of the day, all 4 of Ozawa's carriers were gone. The carrier arm of the Imperial Japanese Navy as an operational force had ceased to exist. In Manila that same week, in a headquarters office thick with cigarette smoke and the sound of distant anti-aircraft fire, another admiral was making a decision that would shape the last year of the Pacific War. His name was Takejiro Onishi. He was 53 years old, a naval aviator by training, newly arrived to command the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines. He was a hard man. A man who had opposed the war with America before it began, on the grounds that it could not be won, and who, having been overruled, now served a war he did not believe in. He had almost no aircraft left. He had fewer trained pilots. And he had, arriving off Leyte, the entire American Pacific offensive. On October 19, 6 days before Ozawa's carriers went down at Cape Agnano, Onishi called together the surviving pilots of the 201st Air Group at Mabalacat Airfield on Luzon. He addressed them in a small ready room. He was calm. He was polite. He explained, in the flat voice of a man who has already thought through what he is asking, that in his professional judgment, only one thing could still hurt the American fleet. A pilot in a Zero fighter, carrying a 250-kilogram bomb, aiming his aircraft directly at the flight deck of an American carrier and detonating himself on impact. He asked for volunteers. He did not raise his voice. He did not appeal to the emperor or to honor, or to the spirit of the ancestors. He gave instead the arithmetic. A Zero attacking a carrier with a bomb and returning had, on current form, essentially no chance of hitting anything. A Zero flown deliberately into the flight deck had, by his calculations, a fair chance of causing serious damage. The pilots volunteered. There is no evidence that anyone refused. The unit was named Shinpu Tokubetsu Kogekitai, the Divine Wind Special Attack Corps. The name came from the typhoon that had destroyed a Mongol invasion fleet in the 13th century. In America and eventually in the world, the word would come to be known by its shorter, spoken form. Kamikaze. It was not, in its origin, an act of fanaticism. It was an act of accountancy. Onishi, in later interrogations before he took his own life at the end of the war, would describe the founding of the Corps in exactly those terms. The math had run out. This was the only sum left on the page. The first attacks were flown 5 days later, on October 25. They hit the escort carriers off Samar, the same day Ozawa's flagship sank at Cape Ingano. One escort carrier, USS St. Lo, was struck by a single zero and blew apart from the resulting fire. She was the first American aircraft carrier ever sunk by a kamikaze attack. She would not be the last. Over the next 10 months, kamikaze aircraft would hit dozens of American ships. Some would sink. Many would be damaged. Fleet carriers would burn. Destroyers would break apart. At Okinawa in the spring of 1945, the attacks would rise to a fury that no American sailor who witnessed them would ever forget, and no American shipyard would fail to replace. Because that, too, was the answer. On March 19, 1945, off the coast of Kyushu, the Essex-Class carrier USS Franklin was struck by a single Japanese dive bomber that penetrated her flight deck and detonated on the hangar deck, where aircraft were being fueled and armed for launch. The resulting fires and explosions killed over 800 of her crew. It was the worst damage any American warship would survive in the entire war. She burned for hours. She lost power. She drifted toward the Japanese coast. She did not sink. Damage control parties fought the fires with the systems the Essex-Class had been designed around. Redundant fire mains. Compartmentalized magazines. Armored decks that contained the blast. She was taken under tow, then steamed under her own power to Pearl Harbor, then across an